What if the greatest minds in Middle-earth already knew how to destroy the One Ring, and simply refused to try? Not because it was impossible, not because the path was closed to them, but because the cost was something no good person was willing to pay, and every good person in the story understood exactly what that cost was. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down. When you sit with Gandalf's refusal at the Council of Elrond. When you read Galadriel's words in the Garden of her Mirror not as wisdom, but as confession. When you follow the thread that Tolkien left in his letters, in the unfinished tales, in the architecture of every refusal that shapes this story from its beginning to its end. There was another way, and the question that will follow us through everything that comes next is this. Was the unwillingness of the wise and the powerful to take the ring and carry themselves into the fire an act of profound wisdom? Or was it the one moment where the humility of the great became, in the cruelest possible sense, the burden of the small? Hold on to that question. We are going to return to it, and each time we do, it will mean something different than it did before. At the Council of Elrond, the assembled representatives of every free people in Middle-earth face a problem that had been building for 3,000 years. The ring exists. Sauron is searching for it. It cannot be used. It cannot be hidden. And the third option, carrying it into the fire of Orodruin, seems nearly impossible for reasons that the movies never fully explain. What the movies compress into a montage of grim faces and a single vote, Tolkien wrote as a debate that covered more theological and strategic ground than anything else in the main text of The Lord of the Rings. Because the council was not simply deciding on a plan. The council was working through, out loud, the full range of options that existed, and naming one by one why each of them failed. 3 options are explicitly tabled. The first, use the ring as a weapon. Boromir argues for this. Take the ring, wield its power against Sauron, turn his own instrument of domination against him. The council rejects this, and Gandalf's explanation is worth reading closely. He does not say it is impossible. He says something far more specific. He says the ring would corrupt any wielder, that its fundamental nature is to seek its master, that anyone who took it would, over time, become a vehicle for Sauron's return rather than his defeat. That is not the same as impossible. That is a description of cost. The second option, hide the ring. Send it to Tom Bombadil, who seems immune to its power. The council rejects this too, because Bombadil would not be able to defend it against Sauron, and sooner or later, Sauron would search everywhere. The third option, destroy it. Cast it into the crack of doom. The Fellowship is formed around this mission. But here is what nobody names at the council. There is a fourth option sitting in that room. It is present in the shape of every refusal, in the structure of every argument about why the ring cannot be used. And no one says it out loud, because saying it out loud would require naming a possibility so painful that the people who understood it best had already decided long before the council met that they would not discuss it. What if someone took the ring, used its power of domination to cut through Sauron's forces and reach Mount Doom, and then chose to walk into the fire with it? Not drop the ring into the fire and step back, walk in, end themselves, and the ring together. A deliberate act of self-annihilation that destroyed not just the ring but its wielder, preventing any possibility of the corruption completing its work, preventing any possibility of the journey becoming something other than what it started as. The council never addresses this option directly, but the shape of every refusal in the room is formed around the knowledge that it exists. Gandalf says he dares not take the ring. In the Fellowship of the Ring, his words are exact. The way of the ring to my heart is by pity, pity for weakness and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe, unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. This is the primary canon of his refusal, stated plainly in the chapter called The Shadow of the Past, and it rewards very careful reading. Gandalf is not saying he would use the ring for evil. He is saying that his specific vulnerability is the desire to use it for good, which would be, in Tolkien's moral architecture, precisely the thing that would corrupt him fastest. A being who picks up the ring intending to dominate for the sake of goodness is a being who will become Sauron. Not gradually, not after years of visible struggle, inevitably, because the ring does not care about intention. The ring cares about domination. Any being who uses it for any reason is channeling the same force, toward the same end, regardless of what they tell themselves at the start of the journey. But notice what Gandalf does not say. He does not say he would be unable to reach Mount Doom. He does not say the power of the ring would destroy him before he completed the journey. He says the ring would enter him through his virtue, through his pity, through his desire to protect the small and the weak, and he dares not let it. Which means the question the Council avoids is not whether Gandalf could reach the fire. The question is whether he would still want to destroy the ring by the time he arrived, whether his desire to do good would have calcified somewhere along the long miles between Rivendell and the Crack of Doom into the desire to do everything. That is the real cost of the forbidden path, and Gandalf understood it completely, and he said no. Now consider what happens in Lothlorien when Frodo offers Galadriel the ring. The scene in the movies is beautiful and terrifying, compressed into about 90 seconds of extraordinary performance. What Tolkien wrote in The Fellowship of the Ring, in the chapter The Mirror of Galadriel, is something more carefully constructed, and most readers move through her words too quickly, carried by the momentum of the story, missing what she is actually confessing. She says she has been tempted for a long time. Think about that. Not that she was tempted in this moment, when a small hobbit held the ring out to her across the edge of a silver bowl. She had been tempted for a long time. The possibility of the ring coming to her had lived in her mind across an unknown expanse of the Third Age. She had thought about it. She had rehearsed the decision. She had done the long interior work of deciding what she would do if it appeared before her, precisely because she was wise enough to know that a decision of this magnitude could not be made in the moment it arrived. Her refusal was not improvised. It was the culmination of a deliberate process of moral preparation that she had been conducting, quietly for decades or centuries before Frodo arrived at her gates. And when she refuses, she describes what she would become with a specificity that the movies flatten into visual spectacle, beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. She would overthrow Sauron. She would not be a dark lord, she says, but a queen, not dark but beautiful and terrible, and all would love her in despair. Now hold that against what Tolkien reveals in the Unfinished Tales, in the section titled The History of Galadriel and Celeborn. Galadriel spent centuries, literal centuries, cultivating Lothlorien as a place that could resist Sauron's direct assault. She bore Nenya, the Ring of Water, one of the 3 elven rings, and used it not to dominate but to preserve, to maintain a sanctuary of memory and light against the encroaching darkness. She was not passive in her long waiting. She was strategic in a way the movies barely hint at, building incrementally a fortress of spirit against the day Sauron returned. She had refused to participate in Celebrimbor's work on the rings, precisely because she understood, before anyone else, where the knowledge of their making would lead. She had been suspicious of Anatar, the gift-giver, who turned out to be Sauron in disguise before the other elven smiths were willing to hear her suspicion named. This was not a being who stumbled into wisdom. This was a being who had been preparing for exactly this kind of choice for the entire length of the age. And so her refusal of the One Ring is not the refusal of someone encountering power for the first time and choosing rightly. It is the refusal of someone who understood with complete clarity what the ring would do to her, what she would become, and who had decided, long before the moment arrived, that she was not willing to pay that price or become that thing. But here is the question she never quite answers. Could she have reached Mount Doom? Tolkien ranks Galadriel in letter 348 as the greatest of the Noldor, except possibly Fëanor. He calls her power of mind one of the highest among the elves still remaining in Middle-earth by the Third Age. She was one of the last beings in Middle-earth who had looked upon the light of the two trees in Valinor before their destruction. A light that Tolkien consistently associates with a deeper kind of spiritual clarity and native power. Her capacity to resist Sauron's direct mental assault was extraordinary. She could bar her mind to him, and, the text implies, read his thoughts in return. She sustained a magical realm for centuries against the constant pressure of his shadow to the south. Picture this. Stand in the garden of Caras Galadon on the night Frodo holds the ring out to her. The light is silver and still. The air carries the kind of weight that comes before a decision that cannot be undone. The ring catches something at the edge of vision, not just light but presence, the accumulated desire of centuries of searching, concentrated in a few grams of metal on a chain. Galadriel's hand opens, not reaching exactly, but opening, the way a hand opens when something is about to be placed in it. And in that fraction of a moment, the entire architecture of her centuries of preparation is being tested. She closes her hand. She turns away. She says she will diminish. She says she will go into the west and remain Galadriel. It is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire legendarium, and most people read it as triumph. It is not only triumph. It is also a choice to let the smallest possible being carry the weight the greatest refuse to carry. And she knew it. And she made the choice anyway. Because she understood something that the movies never quite articulated. The fact that she could have reached the fire was exactly why she could not be the one to carry the ring there. To understand why the forbidden path exists at all, and why it was genuinely forbidden rather than simply impractical, you have to understand what the One Ring actually is, and what its power of domination does at a mechanical level that the main text of The Lord of the Rings never fully explains. In letter 131, Tolkien writes about the Rings of Power in terms that are more specific than anything in the main narrative. He describes them as instruments primarily for the domination of the wills of others. The One Ring was not simply a master switch for the lesser rings. It was a vessel. It contained a substantial portion of Sauron's native power. His capacity for ordering, commanding, and compelling poured into an object during the forge work of the Second Age in a calculated gamble. That the concentration of that power in an external form would give him control over everything the lesser rings touched, and that the object itself would never leave his possession long enough to be turned against him. He was wrong about the second part. But the first part is what concerns us here. When the ring was worn, its wearer did not simply access invisibility or some generic enhancement of strength. They accessed to the degree their own will and native power allowed, something closer to the full weight of Sauron's domination capacity. This is why Sauron himself, wearing the ring at the full height of his power in the Second Age, could hold armies in thrall and order the wills of lesser ring-bearers with the same ease that a commander directs a formation. This is also why Tolkien writes in the same letter that a mortal could not use the ring to any great purpose without being destroyed by it. Not because the ring would refuse to work for them, because the power they were asking to channel was simply larger than any mortal vessel could contain without coming apart. Now hold that against the beings who refused the ring at the council. Gandalf is a Maya. He is, in his native spiritual form, a being of tremendous power, partially incarnated into a frailful human body by the terms of his commission to Middle-earth, but possessed of a deeper nature that Tolkien makes clear in the Unfinished Tales, in the section titled The Istari. His physical body is limited and deliberately constrained. His spirit is not. When Tolkien describes Gandalf driving back the Nazgul at Helm's Deep with a blaze of light, or holding the bridge of Khazad-dûm against a Balrog of the ancient world, these are moments when Gandalf's spiritual nature is permitted to manifest at full strength, when the limits of his incarnation are briefly overridden by the magnitude of what he is confronting. A Maya who took the ring would not be destroyed by the power. They would be redirected by it, slowly bent toward Sauron's purpose. But the process would not be instantaneous. It would take time. Tolkien confirms this indirectly across multiple letters, noting that the corruption of the ring operated differently in beings of different native power. A mortal ring-bearer became a ring-wraith within decades or generations. A being of Maya-level power would resist longer, but the resistance would ultimately fail. Which means there is a window. And here is where the speculation begins, built on the cosmological rules Tolkien established, not contradicting them. A Maya who took the ring with the explicit intention of destroying themselves in the crack of doom, who began the journey immediately before the corruption had taken meaningful hold, who understood from the first moment that the journey's purpose was not arrival but annihilation, might be able to complete that journey before the corruption fully redirected their will. Might. That word carries the entire weight of what the forbidden path actually was, because the corruption the ring introduced was not gradual in a simple linear sense. It entered through the wielder's specific vulnerabilities, through the cracks in their character that love and pity and ambition had created over their long lives. For Boromir, as Tolkien describes, through Boromir's own confession and through the account of his behavior in the Two Towers, it entered through his love of his people and his terror that Gondor would fall if the ring was not used as a weapon. For Frodo, it entered through weariness, through the grinding attrition of months of carrying something that wanted every single hour to be found. For Galadriel, it would have entered through her desire to preserve, to maintain, to make beautiful what was being threatened. For Gandalf, it would have entered through pity. He said so himself. The ring's path to his heart was through pity, through the desire to do good with the kind of strength that only domination could provide. And once pity was compromised, once his desire to help the small and the weak had been bent just slightly toward the desire to organize them, to direct them, to make their survival contingent on his vision, rather than their own choices, the corruption was already underway. And here is the cruelest part. The qualities that would have given a being of Gandalf's or Galadriel's nature the longest window before corruption completed, the qualities that would have bought the most time for the journey to Mount Doom, are exactly the qualities the ring would consume first. Their virtue was both their protection and their point of entry. The ring could not enter through selfishness or ambition in Gandalf or Galadriel, because those things barely existed in them. So it would have entered through what did exist, through love, through pity, through the desire to protect the people and the world they had spent their long lives trying to preserve. And once it entered there, the mission would not simply become corrupted, it would become unrecognizable. The journey to Mount Doom would be remade along the way into something else. A journey of salvation that the ring had converted into a journey of domination so gradually and so thoroughly that the being who arrived at the fire would not know the conversion had happened. This is the mechanism Tolkien describes in Letter 246. The ring always worked to subvert the will of its bearer to Sauron's purpose. But that subversion did not look like obvious evil. It looked like reasonable recalculation, like wisdom. like the recognition that perhaps the pure path of destruction was not the most effective path after all. Now here is a specific detail that almost no casual reader of the legendarium catches, and it makes the forbidden path more haunting than anything else in the main text. Gandalf bore one of the 3 elven rings, Narya, the Ring of Fire. Tolkien reveals this in The Return of the King, in the scene at the Grey Havens, and elaborates in the unfinished tales in the section The History of Galadriel and Celeborn. Círdan the shipwright surrendered Narya to Gandalf when the Istari first arrived in Middle-earth. Círdan recognized, through his gift of foresight, that Gandalf was the greatest of the 5, that the long task ahead would require something specific. The power to kindle fire in the hearts of those who were weary, to resist the shadow of despair when it pressed hardest. Pay attention to this next part. Narya's power was fire, not the ordinary fire of torches or forges. Something more fundamental, more spiritual, connected through the craft of the elven smiths and the knowledge of ring-making to the original creative fire that shaped the world. Now hold that alongside what the crack of doom requires. The One Ring could only be destroyed in fire, specifically in the fire of the mountain where it was forged. Tolkien explains in Letter 131 that the reason no other fire could destroy it is that the ring's essential properties were bound to the specific forge fire of Orodruin, to the place where Sauron's will had been most fully concentrated and shaped into metal. The fire of the mountain was not simply very hot. It was the place where Sauron's power had been most fully externalized, and where, therefore, it could be unmade. Narya's power was fire. Gandalf bore Narya. Is it possible, working only within the cosmological rules Tolkien established, that Narya, used at full power by a willing Maya, who had set aside all the constraints of his commission, in direct contact with the fire of Orodruin, could have served as something more than a trinket on a finger? Could the fire that kindled hearts and resisted despair, turned outward and downward by a being willing to pour his entire nature into it, have destroyed what needed to be destroyed? Tolkien never answers this. He never even raises the question. And Gandalf arrives at the Council of Elrond knowing he bears Narya. He refuses the One Ring. He never suggests using Narya in any capacity against it. The implication embedded in that silence is either that the idea is cosmologically impossible, that Narya's fire and Orodruin's fire are simply different categories and the question makes no sense, or that the idea is possible, and that Gandalf has already considered it, and set it aside for reasons he does not name to the council. Neither conclusion is comfortable. There is one more figure who deserves careful consideration in the context of the Forbidden Path, and he is the one most readers never think to include in this particular conversation. Aragorn. In the Unfinished Tales, in the section titled The Disaster of the Gladden Fields, Tolkien describes the nature of Númenórean inheritance with precise detail. The Númenóreans were men elevated by the Valar, given extended lifespans, gifts of wisdom, a clarity of spirit and will that made them, at their height, the most powerful mortal civilization in Middle-earth's history. They also fell, catastrophically, completely, in the single worst disaster of the Second Age, because the desire for more life, more power, more than mortal men were given, proved stronger than all of their accumulated wisdom and all of the warnings they had received. Aragorn carried that inheritance, all of it, the longevity, the extraordinary will, the capacity to operate at the very edge of what mortal men were capable of, and also the inherited guilt of Isildur's failure at the crack of doom in the Second Age, when Isildur had the ring at the edge of the fire at the end of the War of the Last Alliance, at the moment when the whole catastrophe could have been permanently resolved, and chose instead to keep it. Most readers treat Isildur's failure as simple greed. Tolkien's treatment in The Fellowship of the Ring, in Gandalf's long account of the ring's history, is more complex. The word Tolkien uses about the ring and Isildur is that the ring betrayed him to his death. The ring had already begun working on him before the moment of decision at the fire. By the time Isildur stood there, the decision was already partially made for him. Not by greed, but by the ring's influence moving through his love of his people. His belief that Gondor and Arnor would benefit from the ring's power. His conviction that he was strong enough to wield it differently than Sauron had. He did not have a clean moment of free choice at the crack of doom. He had a moment of compromised will presenting itself as rational decision. Aragorn spent his entire adult life in the shadow of that failure. He refused to claim the throne of Gondor for decades, living under the name Strider, walking the borderlands in anonymity, not only because of political caution, but because he understood, with the particular clarity that comes from knowing exactly what your bloodline has done, what the desire for kingship can do to a man who carries Númenórean power in his inheritance. When the Palantir came into play in the Two Towers, and Aragorn took it from Pippin and chose to use it against Sauron directly, that was not an act of simple heroism. Tolkien makes clear in the appendices that Aragorn survived that encounter, that he was able to wrest the Palantir from Sauron's domination and use it for his own purposes, because his will and his lineage gave him something almost no one else in Middle-earth possessed at that moment. The ability to confront the direct pressure of Sauron's mind and hold his own ground. He did what no one else in the story could have done with that object. Now carry that forward, carefully. If Aragorn could wrestle a Palantir from Sauron's direct mental influence, if his bloodline gave him the capacity to confront Sauron's will without being immediately broken by it, could he have taken the One Ring, used its power of domination to walk into Mordor openly rather than in shadow, reached Mount Doom under the cover of an extraordinary will, and then chosen the fire? Not dropped the ring in and survived. Chosen the fire. Picture this. Aragorn alone, somewhere in the dead of a winter night in the angle where the Dúdin waited between their long patrols of the north. A single candle. The map of Mordor on the rough table in front of him. He knows the way. He knows his own power better than most people in Middle-earth know it, though he rarely names it even to himself. He knows that the question is not whether he could reach Mount Doom. He knows that the question is whether he would still want to destroy the ring when he arrived, whether the power of the ring working through Númenórean blood and the ancient hunger for a throne that he has been resisting since he was 20 would have spent the journey quietly rebuilding the vision of Isildur inside him. The vision of a king who owned the ring and was greater than the kings before him. He cannot know the answer to that question until the moment arrives, and he knows that the moment arriving too late is the same as Isildur at the fire. So the plan folds back into silence, and he picks up the map, and he walks into the next day as a ranger and not a king, because becoming a king before the ring is destroyed would give the ring everything it needs to make the second part of the journey go differently than the first. There is a pattern underlying every refusal in this story, and once you see it, you see that Tolkien embedded it with deliberate and careful precision. In the Ainulindale, the creation myth that opens the Silmarillion, Tolkien describes the making of the world as a collaborative act of music by the Ainur, the angelic powers who serve Ilúvatar. Melkor, the first Dark Lord, the being who preceded Sauron in the role of the great enemy, attempted to assert his own will over the music, to dominate the theme, to make it his rather than Ilúvatar's. Ilúvatar did not fight him. He absorbed the intrusion and turned it into something larger and more complex and more beautiful than the original design had been. The principle embedded in that first act of creation is the cosmological foundation of everything that follows in the legendarium. Domination, the desire to impose one's will on another, is always ultimately self-defeating. The dominator becomes defined by the thing they seek to control, and the controlled thing eventually returns through the dominator's will as something that feels like their own desire. Sauron poured his will into the ring, and the ring became, in some deep sense, Sauron himself in an object. When Tolkien writes in Letter 131 that the destruction of the ring diminished Sauron permanently, rendered him unable to take physical form again, unable to gather power as he had before, this is why. The destruction of the ring was the destruction of a portion of Sauron's essential being. He had externalized too much of himself into an object he believed could never be lost, and when the object was destroyed, the part of himself he had invested in it was destroyed with it. Now think about what this means for anyone who picked the ring up. A being who took the ring and wielded it, even briefly, even with the intention of walking into Mount Doom, was inviting that cosmological principle to operate inside them. Not imposing their will through the ring, but allowing the ring's will, which was Sauron's will, to begin moving through them, as though through a new channel. The domination would flow both ways, and the longer they wielded the ring, the more of Sauron would be present in them, not as an external voice or a detectable pressure, but as something that had been invited inside, something that had begun to feel like their own thinking, indistinguishable from their own reasoning, their own desires. The forbidden path required, at its core, walking willingly into a process that would gradually replace you with your enemy, and trusting that you could make the final choice, the choice to enter the fire, before the replacement was complete. This is not a flaw in the plan. This is the flaw. This is why every being who considered it already understood, without needing to be told, why it could not work. Because you could not know at any given moment of the journey whether the intention you still carried was yours or the ring's. Frodo never walked the forbidden path, not the version that required deliberate self-destruction. But he walked close enough to its edges that the story he completed was shaped entirely by the possibility it was supposed to transcend. In the final approach to Mount Doom, Tolkien is explicit that the ring had taken almost complete hold of Frodo. He can barely speak. He cannot think clearly about anything outside the ring's presence. He has worn it multiple times on the journey from Rivendell, which no bearer should do if they can avoid it, and each wearing has pulled the ring-wraith nature closer to him, making him more visible in the spirit world and more vulnerable to the ring's will. By the time he stands at the edge of the crack of doom, he is not the hobbit who left the Shire a year before. He is something that has been hollowed out by months of spiritual siege, barely held together by Sam's refusal to let go and the momentum of a journey that had become its own kind of compulsion. And at the edge of the fire, he claims the ring. He does not choose to destroy it. He claims it. He puts it on. This moment is one of the most important in the entire legendarium, and it is almost always misread, even by people who love the books deeply. Frodo's failure at the crack of doom is not a betrayal of the quest. It is the completion of something that was built into the design of the story from the very beginning. Tolkien is showing, with unsparing honesty, that no being who had carried the ring as far as Frodo had, for as long as Frodo had, was going to be capable of choosing its destruction at the moment of choice. The corruption had progressed too far. The ring had entered it through wariness, through love, through the grinding attrition of a year of proximity to something that wanted, every single hour, to be returned to its master. Frodo claiming the ring at the fire is Tolkien's final proof that the forbidden path could not have worked. Not because the person who attempted it lacked courage, because no one who had carried the ring far enough to make it useful, far enough to reach Orodruin, with the power of domination active and working, would arrive at the fire with a will still capable of choosing destruction. The ring would not let go at the last moment. That was always the point. Providence intervenes. Gollum bites off Frodo's finger and takes the ring and tumbles backward into the crack of doom. The ring is destroyed not by a choice but by an act that Tolkien explicitly frames in Letter 246 as the working of a will greater than any character's individual decision. Ilúvatar, working through the most wretched creature in the story, the creature who should not have been alive at all by any reckoning of mercy or justice, accomplishing what every great power in Middle-earth had determined was too dangerous to attempt. But here is what nobody talks about in that moment. The cost of refusing the forbidden path was not simply Frodo's suffering, as vast as that suffering was. The cost was distributed across the entire length of the story, across every life that the War of the Ring consumed. Boromir, corrupted by the ring's proximity and his love of Gondor, died on Amon Hen. Not because he was weak, but because the ring found the exact crack in his character, and widened it until he could not hold himself together. Gandalf died on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, a death that was technically avoidable if the Fellowship had not gone through Moria, a route chosen in part because the ring's presence was making every other passage harder to navigate by the day. The Fellowship broke because the ring was working on Boromir, and the break launched Merry and Pippin into Fangorn, and the Ents into war, and Aragorn into a path he had been avoiding for decades. The War of the Ring, with all of its dead at Helm's Deep and on the Pelennor fields, with Theoden killed on the field and Eowyn broken by the encounter with the Witch King, with Denethor burned in his own pyre, and the stewardship of Gondor ended in madness, was the cost of not concentrating the burden in a single act at the beginning of the quest. That is not a judgment, that is an accounting. There is one more dimension of the forbidden path that the main text of The Lord of the Rings never directly addresses, but that Tolkien's letters make impossible to ignore once you have read them. Why did the Valar not intervene? The Valar are the angelic powers of Tolkien's world, beings of tremendous spiritual force, who shaped the physical substance of Middle-earth under Ilúvatar's direction, who fought Melkor in wars that remade the geography of the world, who held the Blessed Realm in the west as a place of light and preservation. By the Third Age, they have withdrawn from direct interference in Middle-earth. They sent the Five Istari as their agents, specifically constrained from using their full power, specifically tasked with inspiring and guiding rather than commanding and compelling. They did not come themselves. Tolkien addresses this in Letter 156. After the disasters of the First and Second Ages, specifically the destruction of Númenor, the Valar's mandate had changed. They were not permitted to override the free will of the peoples of Middle-earth by direct exercise of their power. They could send messengers. They could shape circumstances. They could work through the choices of small and despised creatures to accomplish what force could not accomplish. But they could not arrive and take the ring, because that would have violated the fundamental principle that the resolution of the age had to come from within the story, from the choices of the beings involved. And this is where the forbidden path becomes not just impractical, but wrong in the deepest possible structural sense. The forbidden path was wrong because the thing the story was refusing to do, using domination to counter domination, using power to override the will of other beings and the course of the age, was the very thing Sauron himself represented. The answer to the ring could not be a better ring wielder. The answer to domination could not be better domination. If Gandalf or Galadriel had taken the ring and walked to Mount Doom and somehow impossibly maintained their intention and destroyed themselves in the fire, what they would have proven is that the strong can save the weak by making unilateral decisions on behalf of everyone, which is exactly what Sauron believed. Picture this. Two paths diverge at the edge of the crack of doom. On one path, a being of tremendous power, partially remade by the ring's influence over a long journey, steps into the fire and ends both themselves and the ring in a single act of will. The Dark Tower falls, Sauron is defeated, Middle-earth is saved. And built into the very manner of its salvation is the precedent that the right being with the right intention and the right power can and should make choices on behalf of everyone else, because the wisdom of the great is sufficient authority for the cost paid by the small. On the other path, a small and broken creature bites off a finger and tumbles backward into the flame, and the ring is destroyed not by wisdom, but by hunger, not by will, but by accident, not by the decision of the great, but by the desperation of the least, and the age ends without establishing any precedent about who gets to make the final choice, because the final choice was not made by anyone with the authority to claim it. Only one of these endings unmakes Sauron's work completely. The other replaces it with something that wears a different name. Now return to the question. Was the unwillingness of the wise and the powerful to take the ring and carry themselves into the fire an act of profound wisdom, or was it the one moment where the humility of the great became, in the cruelest possible sense, the burden of the small? The answer is both. And the reason it is both, simultaneously and inseparably, is that Tolkien built a moral world where those two things always arrive together. The right choice and the costly choice are the same choice. The refusal that saves the world from one kind of darkness ensures that another kind of darkness, smaller and more human and more distributed, falls on people who did not choose to carry it. Gandalf and Galadriel were right to refuse, not because they were cowards and not because they lacked the capacity to attempt the forbidden path. They were right because they understood, with the clarity that comes from very long lives and very deep knowledge of the ring's nature, that the attempt would produce the wrong result. The corruption was not a side effect they could power through, it was the mechanism. The ring would not be carried to Mount Doom by a willing sacrifice. The willing sacrifice would arrive at Mount Doom no longer willing, no longer a sacrifice, but something else. Something that had been constructed during the journey out of the best parts of the person who started it, and their rightness cost something real. Their refusal transferred the burden to the small, not through cruelty, not through negligence, but through the fundamental structure of a moral world where power cannot be used to override power, where the ring cannot be carried to destruction by someone capable of using it, where the answer to Sauron has to come from a place Sauron never thought to look. Tolkien was a man who had survived the Battle of the Somme. He had watched his friends die in mud for reasons that could never be made adequate to the cost. He built a world where every victory required something real to be given up, and nothing great was accomplished without something small being broken in the process. He did not believe in clean victories. He believed in the kind of triumph that leaves something permanently diminished even in the winning. The One Ring is destroyed. The Third Age ends. The elves leave Middle-earth one by one. Galadriel and Elrond depart from the Grey Havens, the long work of their age complete and irreversible. The three elven rings lose their power when the one is destroyed. Lothlorien begins to fade. The sanctuary that Galadriel built across centuries, the refuge that preserved so much of what was beautiful in the Third Age, starts its slow dissolution the moment the fire takes the ring. The wisdom of her refusal cost her everything it preserved. Frodo returns to the Shire. He is a different being from the one who left. He cannot settle into the rhythms of a life that should, by every right, feel like restoration. He carries the weight of the ring-bearer's experience in a way that the Shire, with all its goodness and ordinary peace, cannot contain. And eventually he leaves from the Grey Havens on a ship into the West, which is a grace, a mercy extended to ring-bearers by the Valar, but which is also a departure that Sam and Merry and Pippin watch from the shore and then turn away from, back into a world that is better because of what Frodo did and permanently smaller because of what it cost him. This is what the Forbidden Path was protecting against, and this is what it cost to protect against it. You know the ending. The ring falls into the fire. The towers fall. The age ends. What you may not have considered fully is that the story arrived at that ending not because anyone found the right answer, but because every wrong answer was refused by people who understood it was wrong, and the burden fell at last on someone too small to carry it, carrying it anyway, failing at the last moment in a way that Providence had been preparing for across the entire length of the age. The forbidden way existed. It was not impossible. It was not beyond the capacity of at least 3 beings who walked through this story. Gandalf, who bore Narya and carried fire in his nature. Galadriel, who had spent centuries preparing for exactly this kind of choice. Aragorn, who had demonstrated the ability to confront Sauron's direct mental pressure and hold his ground. None of them took it. Not because they were unwilling to sacrifice themselves, because they understood that what would arrive at the fire would not be a sacrifice. It would be a completion, and the thing completed would not be the quest. So the ring went to a hobbit, and the hobbit went as far as any being could have gone, and further than anyone had a right to ask him to go. And at the last moment his will failed, because no will could have held at that last moment. And Gollum completed the work that Frodo began, and the age ended in fire and grief and a new world that was quieter and smaller and more human than Middle-earth had ever quite been before. Was Gandalf's refusal wisdom or a transfer of burden? Was Galadriel's refusal in the garden at Lothlorien the pinnacle of her virtue, or the moment her virtue made a hobbit carry what she would not? The text gives you both. Tolkien gives you both. He believed in providence and in cost, in grace and in grief, in the reality of evil and in the imperfect beauty of everything that resists it. I think about Frodo at the fire, his finger gone, his will broken, the ring claimed and then lost. And I think about the long debate that preceded that moment, the Council of Elrond, the mirror of Galadriel, the silence of Aragorn in the night, and I wonder what it meant that the wisest people in the world understood perfectly why they could not save it, and were right, and that understanding fell on a hobbit anyway, like weather. If this kind of deep dive into the lore you thought you knew is what you come to this channel for, consider subscribing. Every video is built on the full legendarium, not just the movies, not just the main text, but the letters and the unfinished tales and the histories that most fans never reach. The story goes further than you have been told. We will keep going further together.